She didn't speak a word, but the commander still called off the entire exercise. The first thing I noticed about the KATH system was that it smelled wrong. I know that sounds like a small complaint for a soldier standing in the cargo hold of an interstellar coalition transport 42 light years from Earth, about to participate in the most important military exercise in human history. But the air recyclers on the Vorith-built station were calibrated for 8 limb-bound beings who breathed a slightly sulfurous mix, and every inhale I took tasted like a match that had just been struck and then immediately swallowed. My sinuses burned, my eyes watered, and Corporal Elena Vasquez, standing 2 feet to my left, was completely unbothered by all of it. She always was. She stood with her rifle across her chest, her pack straps cinched perfectly, her dark eyes moving slowly across the hold, counting exits. I knew, mapping the faces of the alien soldiers around us, cataloging things the rest of us had not yet thought to catalog. She did not look nervous. She did not look excited. She looked like someone waiting for a delayed train, completely certain it would arrive. I had known Elena for 11 months, and I still could not figure out how she did that. My name is Owen Carter. I was 26 years old when the Coalition Joint Combat Readiness Drill convened in the KTH Orbital Simulation Zone. I held the rank of specialist, which meant I was good enough at my job to be trusted with real equipment, but not yet trusted to make real decisions. I had qualified at the top of my class in environmental navigation, come third in tactical communications, and been told by my training sergeant that I had the situational awareness of a very attentive house cat. He meant it as a compliment. I think our unit was designated Fire Team Cobalt, 6 humans. We were one of 9 fire teams assigned to the drill, 5th units, 2 Salathi units, and us, the only human team. I want you to understand what that meant. Not just symbolically, practically. The Voreth had been a space-faring civilization for over 600 years. They were tall. The shortest one I had encountered reached 2 m with 4 primary limbs and 4 secondary manipulator arms clustered near their upper thorax. Their sensory clusters, which served as eyes and ears combined, sat in a wide band across the upper portion of their heads and gave them roughly 270 degrees of perception without turning. They were strong, fast, and almost impossible to surprise. Their military doctrine was considered the gold standard across 9 known civilizations. They had fought and won 3 interstellar conflicts in the time it took humans to move from bronze tools to basic rocketry. The Salathi were smaller, amphibious, and devastatingly precise in low-gravity environments. Their reaction times were twice the human average. They communicated in layered pulses of bioluminescence that their suits translated into audio for coalition partners. And they had a collective memory system that allowed every soldier in a unit to share sensory data in near real time. They were by any measure remarkable. And then there were us, 6 humans from a species that had managed to reach the stars roughly 40 years ago, largely by borrowing Salathi propulsion schematics in Vorith navigation charts, and then refusing to stop tinkering with both until something worked. We had been in the coalition for 11 years, long enough to have proven we were not a threat, not yet long enough to have proven we were worth anything. The drill was the test. Vorith High. Command had designed it specifically as a pass or fail evaluation. The parameters were classified in detail, but the broad shape was known. Each fire team would be run through a 5 km hostile environment infiltration scenario in the orbital simulation zone, suppression, drones, electronic interference, biometric monitoring that real-time, stress data directly to the Vorith observer panel. The simulation used hard light projection technology to construct physical obstacles, and they drones, while non-lethal, delivered a neural disruption pulse on contact that was by all accounts extraordinarily unpleasant. Failure meant reassignment from coalition joint operations. For a human unit, that was a polite way of saying go home and take your species. With you, I was nervous. I will not pretend otherwise. My palms were damp, and my breakfast had not agreed with me since approximately an hour before boarding. The two soldiers beside me, Hal Porter on my right and Danny Webb behind my left shoulder, were cycling through their own versions of the same feeling. Hal kept checking the buckle on his left bootstrap. Danny was quietly counting her equipment for what I estimated was the 4th time. We were human beings, and human beings were afraid. Alina was not counting anything. Alina had already counted everything. She had also 3 weeks before we boarded. The transport invented a language. I do not use that word loosely. What she built was not a modification of existing military hand signals. Those we already knew, and they were useful but limited, designed for 30 or 40 common commands. What Alina constructed was a complete system, a grammar, 52 base gestures, each with a precise meaning, 37 compound signals built by combining 2 or 3 base gestures in sequence, 8 contextual modifier, small adjustments of wrist angle or finger position that change the tone or urgency of any signal. It accompanied. In total, she had given us a vocabulary of somewhere north of 200 distinct communicable ideas, all of them executable in under 2 seconds by a trained hand. She had built it because she could not speak. 6 weeks before deployment, during a hostage situation in a transit corridor on station, Alina had taken a compressed gas round at close range. The round had been meant for a child, a Salathi child, 7 years old, separated from her family in a riot, and crouched behind a cargo container in exactly the wrong place. Alina had moved without hesitation, and the round had struck her in the throat. The child was unharmed. Alina spent 9 days in a medical bay. The surgeons repaired what they could. What they could not repair was the full function of her vocal cords. She could whisper. Sometimes when she tried hard enough, she could produce something slightly louder than a whisper, but for all practical purposes. And Alina was an extremely practical person. She had lost her voice. Command had flagged her for medical reassignment. A soldier who could not shout commands was, by conventional logic, a liability in high-stress field operations. The review board had the paperwork ready. Alina had submitted a counter-proposal 48 hours later. 42 pages detailed schematics of a non-verbal communication system. She had already begun designing a training schedule, projected efficiency metrics. Note at the end in her careful, even handwriting that read, "A voice is one channel. I have others. Please advise if the coalition requires soldiers who can only operate on one channel." The review board had approved her reinstatement. I think they were slightly afraid of the paperwork. She had then spent 3 weeks drilling our fire team in her system for 4 hours a day on top of our regular preparation schedule. She was a patient teacher, but she did not accept sloppy execution. If your wrist angle was wrong, she would correct it silently by reaching over and repositioning your hand with the precise efficiency of someone calibrating a piece of equipment. She did not look frustrated when you made a mistake. She looked interested in the way a mechanic looks interested when a component behaves unexpectedly. By the end of 3 weeks, Fire Team Cobalt could hold a full tactical conversation at combat speed. Without making a sound, I had watched the Voreth observers during our practice runs in the days before the drill. They had translator units mounted on their communication rigs, sophisticated devices that could parse 47 known coalition languages in real time, including 17 that used no sound at all. The translator units were completely silent when Alina's team ran drills. No input, no output, nothing to translate. The Voreth observers would track us with their wide sensory clusters, and I could see even across the gulf of entirely different biology, something that looked very much like unease. They did not have a word for what we were doing that I would later understand was the entire point. On the night before the drill, I found Alina sitting alone in the observation corridor that ran along the outer ring of the station. The viewport showed the simulation zone below, massive pressurized dome structure mounted to the station's underside, dark. Now its hard light projectors offline. Beyond it, KTH's primary star sat low and yellow-orange on the horizon of the system's 4th planet, and the light it threw was long and slow and ancient. I sat down beside her. She glanced at me, then back at the viewport. After a moment, she raised her hand between us. She signed slowly and deliberately, the way she always did when she wanted to make sure there was no room for misunderstanding. Her fingers moved in a clean practice sequence. They think silence is surrender. She paused. Her eyes stayed on the star. Then she signed the second part, show them what silence sounds like. I sat with that for a long time. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. That was the thing about Alina. She had always understood that the most important things do not require many words. She had simply lost the option to use them anyway, and in doing so had discovered that she had never really needed them. The drill began at 600 hours station time. I remember the moment the lights in the staging bay shifted from amber to green and the door to the simulation zone unsealed with a sound like a held breath being slowly released. I remember the way Hal quietly exhaled beside me, and the way Dani rolled her shoulders once and then went still. I remember Alina at the front of our line turning her head just slightly to look at us. She did not say anything. She raised her right hand, extended 2 fingers, then curved them slightly inward, the sign we had learned on day 1, the one she had made sure we could read in bad light from 10 meters away. With adrenaline in our blood and fear in our throats, it meant follow me and trust me. We went in. I had no idea in that moment that what we were about to do would make 6 Voreth High Command officers sit in complete silence for 11 minutes after the drill ended, that it would cause the most decorated tactical observer in coalition history to request a recess in the middle of a formal military evaluation because he needed Time to think that the word that would eventually be used in the official coalition report filed 48 hours later to describe what Fire Team Cobalt did in that simulation zone was not excellent, or effective, or even impressive. The word they used was unclassifiable, but I'm getting ahead of myself. That is what happens when the story you are telling still surprises you even after you have lived it. You want to skip to the part where everyone finally understands. You want to get to the moment when the room goes quiet in a different way, not the quiet of confusion, but the quiet of recognition. The door sealed behind us. The hard light projectors came online. The simulation zone came to life around us with a sound like the world being assembled from scratch. Elena moved forward without hesitation, and not one of us made a sound. The simulation zone was not designed to be fair. I understood that within the first 40 seconds, the hard light projectors could generate solid physical terrain at a density adjustable up to roughly 70% of standard construction material. What they had built for us was a compressed urban environment, narrow corridors, tall structures, low-hanging conduit lines, broken ground surfaces that shifted texture every few meters, and a ceiling of projected cloud cover that dropped ambient light to roughly 40% of normal. It was the kind of environment where sound traveled in strange ways, bouncing off hard surfaces and bending around corners, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint the origin of a noise, which meant it was the kind of environment where shouting commands, the standard operating procedure for every coalition unit in every known doctrine, was not just unhelpful, it was actively dangerous. I had read the environmental parameters in the pre-drill briefing. I had noted in the dry professional language of military documentation that the zone was acoustically complex. It had not fully registered until I was standing inside it, listening to the way the distant hum of the suppression drones ricocheted off the walls and arrived at my ears from 3 different directions simultaneously, none of which was accurate. Elena had not needed the briefing to understand this. She had asked for the architectural schematics of the zone 2 days earlier, spent 4 hours with them alone in the barracks, and then said nothing about what she had found. She had simply adjusted 3 of our compound signals the following morning during practice, adding a new modifier for confined acoustic environment without explanation. We had learned it. That was how things worked. With Elena, the objective was a data node at the far end of the zone, physical device mounted in a hardened enclosure that we had to reach, access, and extract a coded signal from all. Within a 40-minute window, the suppression drones would engage any unit that broke cover, triggered a motion sensor in one of 12 designated alert zones, or produced a noise above a threshold the briefing had specified as conversational volume. There were 9 drones in total, each operating on an independent patrol cycle, each capable of covering its zone in under 90 seconds. The neural disruption pulse they carried was non-lethal but cumulative. A second hit within 3 minutes of the first produced significantly more disorientation than the first alone. 3 hits within 5 minutes and a soldier was effectively non-functional for 10 to 12 minutes. Other coalition units had received the same briefing. The first Vorath unit entered the zone 8 minutes before us. They had drawn the first slot in the randomized schedule. Their doctrine called for a 3-point command structure with a lead caller issuing movement orders verbally to 2 flanking sub-commanders who relayed to their soldiers in the open environments. Vorith doctrine was built for wide planes, orbital stations with high ceilings and clear sight lines. This was devastatingly effective in the simulation zone. It lasted approximately 4 minutes before their lead callers' positions was triangulated by a patrol drone responding to the echo of a relay command off a hard wall. He took a disruption pulse. The command chain fractured. They reached the 60% mark. Before their window closed, 60% was the best result the Vorith had seen in 6 previous iterations of this exercise. I know all this because we had access to the live monitoring feed in the staging bay. While we waited for our slot, I watched the Vorith unit move through the zone on the observer display. Watched the moment the drone locked on. Watched the clean efficiency of their formation begin to come apart. I felt something strange watching it, not satisfaction and not smugness. Something closer to the feeling you get when you watch a very good machine encounter the wrong kind of problem. The Vorith soldiers were excellent. Their doctrine was excellent. The zone was designed for a different kind of excellent. Alina watched the same feed. Her expression did not change. She glanced once at Hal, once at Danny, then at the remaining 2 members of our team, Cooper Lane and Ruth Adler, and signed a single phrase, a short one. 4 gestures in sequence, different ground, same plan, trust each other. Cooper nodded once. Ruth touched her thumb to her first 2 fingers, the sign we used for understood. Hal and Danny did the same. I did the same. Then the amber light shifted to green, and it was our turn. Alina took point. She always took point. This was not a rank decision. She was a corporal, the same as me, and below Hal, who technically held the highest grade in our unit. It was a capability decision, and everyone, including Hal, understood that. Alina's spatial memory was extraordinary. She could hold a 3-dimensional map of a space in her head and navigate it in real time, updating as she moved, flagging discrepancies between the map and the actual terrain with the casual accuracy of someone correcting a minor typo. In the 3 weeks of preparation, she had run our team through mock infiltration courses 7 times. Not once had she taken a wrong turn. We moved in a staggered file, Alina at front, then me 3M back and to her left, then Cooper at her right, then Hal, then Danny, then Ruth covering our rear. Spacing was deliberate, tight enough that hand signals were readable, wide enough that a single drone pulse could not affect more than one of us. The first alert zone was a wide corridor between 2 tall projected structures 30 m long. The drone that patrolled it ran a 90-second cycle, 60 seconds traversing the corridor from south to north, then a brief sensor sweep at the north end, then 30 seconds back. Alina had timed it. From the schematics, we had exactly 22 seconds in which the corridor was clear. She stopped us at the corner. Her left hand went up, flat palm fingers together hold. We held. The drone hummed past on its return pass, close enough that I could see the sensor cluster on its underside rotating in a slow, methodical arc. None of us breathed loudly. None of us moved. The drone passed. Alina waited 3 more seconds. I counted them without being asked because 3 weeks of training had made that automatic. Then her hand turned, fingers curling forward. We moved. 22 seconds was more than enough. We cleared the corridor in 14, sliding into the shadow of a projected overhang. On the far side, pressing flat against the wall while Elena checked the next segment, the Salathi unit that had run the slot before us had been eliminated. In this corridor, they were fast and precise, but their bioluminescent communication, even muted to the low levels they used for tactical signals, had tripped a light-sensitive proximity sensor in the wall of the southern structure. 1 pulse from the drone. 2 Salathi soldiers temporarily non-functional, and the unit's collective sensory sharing system had registered the disruption as system-wide disorientation. They had needed to pause, regroup, and re-establish their shared sensory baseline. The lost time had cost them the objective. We had no light to emit. We had no sound to make. We were, as far as the sensors in that corridor were concerned, effectively invisible. I am not going to pretend this was effortless. It was not. My heart rate was at approximately 150 beats per minute for the first 15 minutes of the exercise. Every time I had to pass a signal back to Danny, I was intensely aware of the drone patrol patterns, the positions of the alert zone sensors, the distance to the next piece of cover. My hands were steady. The training had made them steady, but my chest felt like it was being slowly compressed by something very large and very patient. What I noticed somewhere around the 12-minute mark was that the fear was not slowing me down. This was not something I had expected. I had operated under pressure before in training and in 2 minor field postings, and my experience of fear was that it made everything slightly slower and slightly louder, the brain working too hard on the wrong things, attention scattering when it needed to focus. What was happening now was different. The silence around us was not empty. It was full of information, passed hand to eye to hand, clean and fast, and impossible to intercept. There was no verbal noise to filter. There was no shouted command to wait for or misunderstand. Elena would signal, and the signal would arrive, and the response would happen. The chain was short, and it was direct, and it did not break. The drone in the second sector was running a modified pattern. Either the briefing had been slightly out of date, or it had been adjusted in the hours since the Voreth unit had run. Elena spotted it. Within 90 seconds of entering the sector, she stopped us, pressed us into cover, and held position for 2 full minutes while she watched the drone complete 3 full cycles. Then she turned to me. Her hands moved. New path. Eastern wall slower. I need you on my right. I signed back, understood, moving. She had already mapped the revised route. By the time I reached her shoulder, I know that because she started moving before I had fully settled into position. And every turn she took was deliberate, not exploratory, not cautious. She knew where she was going. She had solved the new problem in the 2 minutes we were holding cover, quietly using only the information her eyes were collecting and the map she was carrying in her head. I thought, not for the first time, that Elena Vasquez was one of the most frightening people I had ever met in the best possible way. We reached the halfway point of the zone at the 19-minute mark. Our window was 40 minutes. We were ahead of schedule. More importantly, not one of us had been touched by a drone. The Voreth observer post was mounted high on the northern Wall of the zone, a pressurized booth. Behind transparent panel giving the evaluation team an unobstructed view of the terrain below. I could not see their faces in detail from ground level, but I could see the booth. And at the 19-minute mark, when I glanced up during a hold at the entrance to the third sector, I saw that several of the Voreth observers had moved to the forward edge of the booth. They were watching us, not scanning, not reviewing data on their monitoring systems, watching the way you watch something that does not match the category you placed it in. I looked away. I had to stay focused, but I filed that image somewhere useful, and I thought about what Alina had signed to me the night before. They think silence is surrender. They were beginning, I suspected, to revise that assessment. The third sector was the most complex in the zone. It was a wide open space, simulated plaza, roughly circular 60 m across, with a data node enclosure visible on the far side behind a hardened projected barrier. There were 3 drones in the plaza, not on fixed patrol cycles, but on dynamic routing. The briefing had described them as responsive, meaning they adjusted their paths in real time based on sensor input from the broader zone. If a unit made noise in the second sector, the plaza drones moved to investigate. If the north sensor array picked up movement in a restricted zone, the plaza drones tightened their coverage pattern. This was why the 60% mark was the best result any coalition unit had previously achieved. The first 2 sectors were manageable. The plaza was designed to be a wall. Alina studied it for 4 minutes from the cover of the sector entrance. I watched her watch it. I watched her eyes track each drone in sequence, then together, then in pairs. I watched her count. I watched her head tilt by approximately 3 degrees, the way it always did when something in her thinking had just resolved into clarity. She turned to me. Her hands were very still for a moment, and then she began to sign, not a short phrase this time, a full sequence, the longest I had seen her produce in a single transmission. During a live exercise, I caught every word. I had never been more grateful for 3 weeks of 4-hour practice sessions in my life. She had found something in the drone routing pattern that the briefing had not mentioned, and that no previous unit had identified, because no previous unit had standing silently in the sector entrance for 4 uninterrupted minutes, watching without making a single sound to alter the drone's behavior. The responsive routing system adjusted based on sensor data from the broader zone in the absence of any sensor data, in the absence of sound, light, or electronic signal. The system was running on its baseline program, and the baseline program had a gap 12-second window repeated every 93 seconds, during which all 3 drones were in the southernmost quarter of the plaza at the same time, and the central and northern sections were clear. 12 seconds, 60 m. She had already worked out the path. I signed the plan back to her to confirm I had understood it correctly. She watched my hands, then gave the single nod, chin down, chin up. Clean and decisive. That meant yes. Exactly that. I passed it back down the line, Cooper to Hell to Danny to Ruth. Each confirmation arriving as a touch to 2 fingers. Understood, understood. Understood, unders. We wait for the window. Alina counted the seconds in her head. I could see the tiny rhythmic flex of the muscles in her jaw, the way she always counted. At second 89 she raised her hand. At second 92 she curled her fingers forward. We crossed the plaza. 11 seconds. The data node was behind us. In the enclosure. Elena was on it in 4 more seconds, her hands moving over the access panel with the same economy of motion she applied to everything. The coded signal extraction took 22 seconds. She completed it, sealed the panel, and turned to sign the extraction confirmation at that moment from the observer booth high on the north wall. Unto sounded 3 short pulses, evenly spaced. The drill abort signal. We all stopped. I looked up at the booth. Lights inside had shifted, no longer the operational green of an active evaluation. They were white neutral. Elena looked up too. Her expression was very still. Then slowly a small chain moved across her face. Not quite a smile, something quieter than a smile. Something like the expression of a person who has been waiting a long time for a very specific thing to happen and has just watched it happen exactly as expected. She had known. I realized it. Standing there in the plaza with 11 minutes still on our clock and the data node signal already extracted, she had known this was how it would end, not with a completed exercise but with a stopped one. She had understood something about the Voreth that the rest of us had only begun to sense. The door to the staging bay opened. A coalition liaison officer appeared at the zone entrance, a young Salathi with a portable translator unit clipped to her collar. Fire Team Cobalt, she said. Careful accented English. Please stand down and return to the staging bay. Evaluation has been suspended. I looked at Hal. Hal looked at Danny. Danny looked at Cooper. Cooper looked at Ruth. We all looked at Elena. She had already slung her rifle to her back. She was walking toward the exit. She did not look back at the data node or at the 3 suppression drones that were now hovering stationary in the south of the plaza with their patrol cycles suspended. She did not look up at the observer booth. She walked with the unhurried pace of someone who has finished a task and is simply moving on to whatever comes next. I followed her. We all followed her. That was what you did with Elena. The staging bay felt different when we walked back into it. It is difficult to describe, but I will try. The room was the same room, the same amber lighting, the same long equipment benches along the walls, the same smell of recycled air and synthetic polymer that every military facility in the coalition shared regardless of which species had built it. The Salathi liaison officer was standing near the inner door with her translator unit live and her expression professionally neutral. 2 human technicians from the monitoring team were at their consoles, and both of them had stopped whatever they had been doing and were looking at us, not at us collectively, at Elena. She did not appear to notice. She moved to the nearest bench and sat down, unclipped her pack and set it on the surface in front of her with the quiet efficiency of someone at the end of an ordinary shift. She reached into the outer pocket and produced a ration bar, the dense, tasteless, compressed nutrient kind that nobody ate by choice, only by necessity, and began to eat. Her eyes went to the viewport on the far wall. Beyond the viewport, the simulation zone was still lit, drone suspended, hard light terrain intact. She looked at it the way someone looks at a finished puzzle. I sat down beside her. Hal dropped onto the bench across from us. Danny, Cooper, and Ruth arranged themselves nearby, quiet, waiting. We did not know what we were waiting for. We knew that we were waiting because something had happened that needed explaining, and the explaining had not yet arrived. It arrived in the form of coalition liaison Officer Naravist. She was Salathi young, which for Sally meant the bioluminescent. Patches along her collar were a pale, steady gold rather than the deeper amber. Of maturity, her English was precise, learned rather than native, with the careful over-enunciation of someone who has studied a language in a classroom and has not yet had enough informal conversation to smooth the edges. She sat down across from us with her hands folded on the table in the Salafi gesture of professional address, and she looked at us in the way Salafi always looked at humans, with genuine interest, barely contained beneath professional composure. "I will tell you what I can," she said, "and I will be honest that I do not have the full picture yet. What I can tell you is that the evaluation suspension was called by Commander Eshkara, and that his reasoning was communicated to the Coalition Council approximately 9 minutes ago." She paused. In the Salafi communication style, pauses had meaning. They were not emptiness but punctuation, and invitation for the listener to confirm readiness before the next block of information arrived. None of us spoke. Alina continued eating her ration bar. Commander Eshkara's statement, Naravez continued, was delivered in formal Vor Council Register, which the translation unit rendered at approximately 91% fidelity. "I will give you the substance of it because I think you deserve to hear it." She unfolded her hands and set them flat on the table. Her bioluminescent patches pulsed once, faintly in the amber register that her translator unit rendered as emphasis. He said, "We call the exercise because it became a demonstration, not a drill. The human unit has presented a model of cognition under duress that our threat assessment protocols have no classification for. We cannot evaluate what we do not understand, and we do not understand this." The staging bay was silent for a moment. Then Hal said very quietly, "They stopped the drill because we were winning. They stopped the drill," Naravis said, "because they did not know what to call what you were doing, which is different." She looked at Alina. Alina looked back at her, still eating, expression still and open in that way that she had, the way that was not blankness but attention, deep, steady, patient attention. "May I ask," Naravist said, addressing Alina directly, "how long did it take you to develop the communication system your unit used?" Alina raised her right hand from the ration bar and signed a single phrase. I translated aloud because Alina had a standing arrangement with me that in formal or official conversations I would voice for her. 3 weeks of structured development. The foundation took 2 days. Naravis nodded slowly. Her patches pulsed again. "And the system is original. You did not derive it from an existing human sign language," she says. I translated, watching Alina's hands, that it borrows some structural principles from existing systems, but the tactical grammar is original. She built it for this environment. She built it in 3 weeks, Naravis said. Not quite to us, not quite to herself. It was the tone of someone filing a fact, a place where they can find it again. She built it, Hal said, because she needed it. Naravis looked at Hal. Yes, she said. After a moment, that is exactly what I mean. The inner door opened. The Salafi liaison rose from the table and gestured for us to remain seated. A Salafi politeness signal meaning wait, this is not trouble, and moved to meet the figure. Coming through the door, it was a Voreth officer, one of the lower ranked observers from the booth with a translation relay unit on his upper left arm and the characteristic wide sensory band fully alert, scanning the room as he entered. He spoke briefly to Naravist in Voreth standard, which sounded to human ears like a series of tonal resonances, layered on top of each other, rich and complex and completely incomprehensible. Without a translator, Naravist returned to the table. The observer panel has formally requested a debrief with Fire Team Cobalt at 1600 hours station time. They wish to understand the communication system, not to assess it. She added, and I noticed that she chose that distinction carefully to understand it. Commander Eshkara has specifically requested that the system documentation be made available. He wants the language, Cooper said from the end of the bench. He wants to know what to call it. Naravist said he wants to know where to put it. I looked at Alina. She had finished the ration bar. She was folding the wrapper into a precise rectangle with the unhurried focus of someone with nothing else pressing at the moment. Without looking up, she signed. Her hands moved in a short, clean sequence that I had never seen before. Not one of the 52 base gestures, not a compound signal from the code book she had spent 3 weeks drilling into us. Something new, something she was making up on the spot. I watched her hands carefully. The gestures were legible if I mapped them against the grammatical structure she had taught us. The literal translation was close to a system without a drawer. Does not mean no drawer exists. It means you have not built the drawer yet. I stared at her for a moment, then I turned to Naravist and translated it as faithfully as I could. Naravist looked at Alina for a long time. Her bioluminescent patches shifted through 2 colors I did not have names for, cycling slowly in what the cultural briefings I had read described as the Salathi expression of encountering something that rearranges a settled idea. I would like to include that in my report, she said, if you will permit me. Alina looked at her and gave a small nod, the same nod she gave to everything she had already decided the answer to before the question arrived. What I did not say to Narav, because it was not my place to say it, was that what I had just witnessed was not unusual for Alina Vasquez. She did not make things up on the spot because she was being clever or showing off. She made things up on the spot because her mind worked in a particular way, the way of a person who has spent a long time thinking about how things connect and who does not feel a strong distinction between a new thought and an old one, because all thoughts are simply the same mind examining different parts of the same landscape. I want to stay on this point for a moment because I think it matters. It matters to the story I am trying to tell, and it matters to the thing about humans that this story is really about. What Alina had done was not a miracle. It was not a superpower. She had not been born with some special capacity that separated her from the rest of our species. She was a person who had been good at several things: languages, spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, chess, and who had, through no choice of her own, been placed in a situation where those things became necessary in a new way. Her voice had been taken from her, and she had built another one. That was it. That was the whole story in miniature. But I had been thinking in the hours since the drill ended about why that story was so difficult for the Voreth to process. The Vorath had been in space for 600 years. They had encountered 32 sapient species. In that time, they had fought 3 wars, concluded 9 alliances, built a military doctrine that was considered the most sophisticated in the known galaxy. They understood competition. They understood adaptation. They understood intelligence in all the forms. Their 6 centuries of experience had shown them what they had not encountered was a species that did what we did when something broke. I had read in the same cultural briefings I mentioned earlier that the Vorath had a concept at the center of their social and military philosophy that translated roughly as form follows nature. The idea was that capability was biological. You were built to do certain things, and those things defined your role, and your role defined your value. Avorith with impaired sensory clusters was reassigned to functions that did not require full perception, not out of cruelty, out of logic. The form defined the function, and when the form changed, the function changed accordingly. Alina had not changed her function. She had changed her form. She had looked at the thing that was broken and invented a new component to replace it, built from scratch in 3 weeks out of nothing but air and hands and 300 years of human history with sign language that had begun not as a military tool but as a way to make sure that deaf children were not alone. That last part was important. I kept coming back to it. We had not invented sign language for combat. We had not developed nonverbal communication systems to gain a tactical advantage over alien militaries we had not yet met. We had developed them because somewhere in our history a parent had looked at a child who could not hear and had thought, I will find another way to tell you that I love you. That was the origin. Thousands of years ago, in a world that had never heard of the KTH system or the Vorath High Command or the Interstellar Coalition, someone had looked at a limitation and refused to accept that it was a wall. They had looked at it and seen a door. Alina was that instinct, its purest, most concentrated form. She had not been trying to impress anyone. She had not built her language as a tactical exploit, even if it had become one. She had built it because not being able to communicate was not something she was prepared to accept. The gap existed. She filled the gap. The gap was now a bridge. Commander Ashkara did not know what to call it because his civilization's philosophy had no drawer for it. In 600 years of space travel and 32 encountered species and 3 fought wars, he had not seen a species that responded to a broken component by building a better one out of raw logic and stubbornness and a refusal to define themselves by what they had lost. The DB brief at 1600 hours was long. I sat beside Alina and voiced her answers for the record. The Vorath officers asked methodical, precise questions, the kind that revealed in their structure exactly how the questioner's mind was organized. They wanted to know the derivation of each gesture. They wanted to know the grammatical rules. They wanted to know the training schedule, the error rate, the rate of improvement across the 3 weeks of drilling. They took all of this information with the careful attention of people who were genuinely trying to understand something and who had set aside, at least for the duration of this room, the assumption that they already had the framework to understand it. At one point, the senior officer on the panel, Najkara himself, who was not present but his second, a figure called Vorith rank Dresden, which the translation unit rendered as analytical. Third, asked a question that the translator unit initially struggled with. It took 3 passes to render it into English because the Vorith concept it expressed did not have a clean analog. The closest approximation was, what is the source, not the source of the language. He had the derivation notes. He wanted to know what had produced the impulse to build it, what had caused Alina, when faced with the loss of her voice, to decide that the correct response was to invent a new one, rather than to accept reassignment. Alina was quiet for a moment when I translated this for her. She looked at the wall behind the panel, then her hands moved. I watched them carefully. The sequence was longer than usual. When she finished, I turned to the panel and translated. She says, we come from a planet that is very good at killing things. It has been trying to kill us for a very long time. Every winter, every drought, every sickness, every predator, all of it has been trying to end us since we were small enough to be eaten in one bite. We are still here because we could not stop trying to find another way through. She says she did not decide to build the language. It did not feel like a decision. It felt like the only thing a person could do. The room was quiet. Dressen's sensory cluster was very still. In Voreth's body language, according to the cultural briefings, a motionless sensory cluster indicated deep cognitive processing. Voreth, equivalent of a furrowed brow, held breath, a mind working hard on a problem that mattered. After a moment, he said something. The translator unit took 6 full seconds to render it. In my experience, longer render times meant the concept being translated had no natural equivalent in the target language, and the system was improvising. What it produced after those 6 seconds was this: we think we understand the danger of humans now. It is not what we thought it was. I did not ask what they had thought it was. I think I knew. I think they had thought the danger of humans was the danger of aggression, of ambition, of a young species climbing fast and wanting more than it deserved. The danger they were describing now was different. It was the danger of a species that, when you blocked every road, sat down in the dark, and built a new one. Alina was looking at her hands in her lap, relaxed and still. She did not look like someone who had just been called dangerous. She looked like someone listening to a description of whether she had already lived through. The debrief ended at 1843. We were formally dismissed. As we filed out of the room, I stayed close to Alina, and when we were in the corridor outside, I signed to her clumsily, because I was never as fluent as she was. The phrase I had been sitting with since the staging bay. They finally understand. She glanced at me sideways. Her expression was fond and slightly amused in the way that it only ever got when she thought someone had asked a question with an obvious answer that they had somehow missed. She raised one hand and signed back slow enough for me to catch every word. They understand. Today, that is enough for today. Then she put her hands in her pockets and walked ahead of me down the corridor, and I followed her the way I always did. The way all of us did, not because she commanded it, because she was Alina, and where Alina went, things tended to make more sense when you arrived. The official coalition report was filed 48 hours after the drill ended. I did not see it immediately. Field personnel rarely see their own after-action documentation in real time. I was in the Barracks running a maintenance check on my equipment when Hal came through the door holding a printed copy, physical paper, which meant he had found an actual printer somewhere on the station, which in itself was a small miracle, and dropped it on the bench beside me with the expression of someone delivering news they were still processing. Read the classification section, he said. Part where they describe our unit. I read it. The document was 43 pages dense, with coalition procedural language, metrics, tables, and analysis written in the formal register used for high-level military evaluation. The classification section, which assigned each participating unit a category rating for integration into coalition tactical doctrine, was near the end. The Voreth units had been classified under existing doctrine categories: sound dominant, command structure high efficiency, and standard coalition protocol compliant. The Salathi units had been classified similarly, with notes on bioluminescent communication advantages in low light environments. Fire team cobalts classification red, no applicable. Existing category, see addendum. Unclassifiable by current protocol, refer for new category development below that. In a section marked Observer Notes, Commander Iskara Vorth High Command was a paragraph that the translator had rendered in clean, careful English. I read it twice before I was sure I had understood it correctly. The human unit operated within the exercise parameters, using a communication methodology that produced zero detectable output across all monitored channels: acoustic, electromagnetic, bioluminescent, chemical. The unit's internal coordination appeared not merely effective but structurally superior to standard coalition protocol in the specific environmental conditions of the zone. The system was developed in response to a physical impairment sustained by the unit's deacto operational lead. The methodology is in the assessment of this panel a direct product of human adaptive response to adverse circumstance and represents a category of tactical capability for which current coalition doctrine has no framework. Recommendation: new doctrine category. Required further study of human adaptive methodology recommended across coalition training programs. I sat with that for a while, then I put the report down and went to find Alina. She was in the observation corridor again, the same place I had found her the night before the drill, same viewport, same long yellow-orange light from Kareth star, same posture, back straight, hands in her lap, completely and utterly at rest in the way of a person who has made peace with how to occupy space. I sat down beside her and held up the printed report. She glanced at it. Read the classification section. When I opened it to the right page, I watched her face. She read it twice the way I had, then looked back at the viewport. I signed to her. How does it feel? She was quiet for a moment. The light from KTH star shifted slightly as the station's slow rotation carried us through the angular variation, a few degrees of difference that changed the color at the edge of the window from amber to a warmer, deeper gold. Then she signed back. It feels like a beginning. I thought about that. I thought about all of it. 3 weeks of drilling, the 40 minutes in the simulation zone, the staging bay, the debrief room, Dresian 6-second translated question, the 43 pages with the word unclassifiable printed in clean coalition script. I thought about Alina in a medical bay, unable to speak, building a language. What kind of beginning? I asked aloud, forgetting for A moment to sign it, she tapped my arm. Gently, her standard reminder. I signed it again properly. She smiled for the first time in what felt like a very long while. It was not a large smile. It was the kind that lives in one corner of the mouth and means something specific, not happiness exactly, but the feeling of seeing a road open where you were not certain one existed. Her hands moved. The kind where they make a drawer. I did not ask her to explain it. I already understood. The Vorath had said they needed to build a new category, a new drawer for what we were, for what she had done, for the thing that had happened in the simulation zone when 6 humans moved through a hostile environment without making a single sound and arrived at the objective before anyone else, and did it because a woman had been told she could not speak and had decided that was a problem with the word cannot rather than a problem. With her, they were going to build a drawer, and when they built it, they were going to find things in their own histories and the histories of the 32 species they had encountered that fit into it. Small moments of adaptation, small acts of refusal, small decisions made in the dark that turned losses into architecture. They were going to look for those things because Alina had made them look. That was the beginning she was describing. I looked out the viewport beside her. The simulation zone was dark now, hard light projectors offline, the dome structure silent against the body of the station. In 24 hours we would receive our formal coalition integration assignment. In 48 we would be given our first joint operational posting. In 6 months I would attend a coalition training symposium where a Vorath tactical instructor would, for the first time in the recorded history of Vorath military education, teach a session on nonverbal communication systems. He would use Alina's code book as the primary reference material. He would begin the session by saying in careful translated English that the most dangerous thing military organization can do is confuse a limitation with a definition, but I did not know any of that yet. I was just sit aside Alina, looking at the stars and thinking about drawers. She tapped my arm again and I looked over. She was holding out the second half of her ration bar. I took it because some things did not require a language. 4 months after the drill, Alina was reassigned. I do not use that word the way it was used before when command had tried to use it as a polite way of telling her she was no longer useful. This reassignment was the other kind, the kind that comes in a sealed notification with a coalition header and a formal offer of a new position, and that you can decline if you want to, but almost nobody declines because the position is the kind that only gets offered when someone at a very high level has decided you are exactly the right person for something important. The position was lead developer, coalition cross-species nonverbal communication doctrine. She would be designing the framework, the entire framework, not just the tactical hand signals, but the underlying grammar, the cross-species adaptation protocols, the training methodology. She would be working with linguists and military tacticians and cultural specialists from 7 species, building something that had never existed before, making the drawer. I was in the common room when she received the notification. She read it on her data unit, set it face down on the table, picked it up and read it again, then set it down again. A long moment passed, then she picked up her stylus and signed something in the air, which was something she only did when there was no one nearby to receive the signal, and she was communicating to herself or to no one or to the space around her. I was close enough to read it. She signed, "There we go." That was Elena. No performance, no ceremony, just a woman who had built a door and was now being asked to build a building, and who was ready to begin. She spent her last evening with our fire team in the common room, and we all signed her goodbyes, because that was the language we shared. And it was ours, and it mattered. When she got to me, she paused, and then she signed something I had not seen before. Something outside the code book, outside the tactical grammar, outside anything she had formally taught us. I watched her hands carefully, but this one I could not fully parse. Gestures were clean and precise, and the structure was familiar, but the combination was new, a new idea. I stared at her. She looked back at me with that expression, open, steady, patient, that I had spent 11 months trying to understand and had never fully managed. She waited to see if I would ask. I almost did. The question was right there, fully formed, ready to speak or sign, but then I thought about what she had said in the staging bay on the day the drill ended, about things that do not need translation, about the feeling of a message that does not require a channel, that arrives in the space between people and simply exists there, understood not through language, but through everything that language points at. I did not ask. She nodded once, that clean, decisive nod that meant yes, exactly that, and picked up her pack and walked out of the common room. I sat there for a while, holding the unsigned thing she had given me, turning it over in my mind the way you turn a stone in your hand when you know there is something inside that you cannot yet see. I still carry it. I do not know what it means in any formal sense. I know what it feels like, which is different. It feels like a beginning. There are things I want to say now at the end of this that are harder to say than the rest of it, not because they are complicated, but because they are simple in the way that simple things are sometimes harder to put into words than complicated ones. Elena Vasquez did not save the world. She did not win a war. She did not discover a new energy source, or broker a peace treaty, or invent faster than light travel. She built a language, ran a drill, and changed the way one very old and very proud civilization thought about what it meant to lose something. That is all, and it is also everything. I think about the child in the transit corridor on station, the Salafi child, 7 years old, who is somewhere now, who may not know the name of the woman who stepped in front of a compressed gas round to keep her unharmed. I think about whether that child knows what happened in the Karth system 4 months later, and whether, if she does, she understands that the line runs straight and clean from one moment to the other, from a woman moving without hesitation in a corridor to a woman moving without hesitation into a simulation zone, carrying a language she had built in a medical bay while her voice was being repaired, and she had decided with characteristic patience and characteristic stubbornness that if one channel was closed, then she would simply build another. The thing I have been trying to say through all of it is this: the Voreth called us unclassifiable. Dashan said they finally understood the real danger of us. Naravs included Elena's words in her report and told me later that it was the most quoted line in the document. translated into 11th coalition languages. Within a month of filing, but I do not think the thing we showed them was dangerous. I think dangerous was the word they used because they did not yet have a better one they were building. The drawer still, the word I would use is stubborn, the word I would use is inventive, the word I would use is the same word that is written in every human story that has ever been worth telling, in every language we have ever built, in every gesture Alina's hands ever made. The word is again, as in we got knocked down, as in we tried again, as in the road was blocked so we made another one, as in they told her she could not speak so she invented a new way to be heard. They stopped the exercise because they did not know what to call us. We already knew, we have always known, we are the ones who do not stop. And